It's always nice to see an older game that you missed get a remaster, especially in a franchise you care a lot about. Last year I had the privilege of playing NieR Automata for the first time, and I fell in love with it almost immediately. Featuring a beautiful soundtrack, spectacular gameplay, and an emotional and thought-provoking narrative, Automata was unlike any game I'd ever played before, and it quickly became one of my favorite games from the last console generation. It was a game I'd had my eye on for a long time, but was hesitant to play because I hadn't played the first NieR that came out back in 2010, nor the Drakengard series from which NieR had spun off from. After being reassured by fans of these games that I didn't need to play any previous game to understand and enjoy Automata, I finally decided to give the game a shot, and I'm very glad that I did. However, after beating Automata, I had a strong desire to go back and play the original NieR. While I was able to follow and enjoy the story of Automata, there were certain references to the previous NieR that kind of went over my head because I hadn't played that game. I wanted to experience this first game for myself so that I could have a better appreciation and understanding of the NieR universe. Fortunately for me, a remaster of NieR Replicant was announced around the same time I was playing through Automata. This was the perfect opportunity for me to go back and finally play through the first game with updated graphics and gameplay, something I was honestly pretty relieved about. While the original NieR looks fine for a 2010 game, I don't think it really compares graphically or mechanically to Automata. Remastering the game was a great way to reintroduce it to people like myself who missed it 11 years ago but played through Automata. After finally getting a chance to play through this remaster, I can safely say that this game is every bit as good as its sequel. While it definitely has a couple of areas it could have improved on, NieR Replicant was still a joy to play from start to finish, and a game I hope more people decide to play. What I'd like to do in this video is walk through this remaster of NieR Replicant to help people understand what they can expect out of this game and why I think it's so fantastic. I'll also be making numerous comparisons to NieR Automata throughout the video because I think that's important for understanding what this game does well and where it falls short. So with that being said, here's my review of NieR Replicant version 1.2247. To kick things off, let's talk about the game's story and characters, which for me were the strongest parts of NieR Replicant, coupled with the game's amazing soundtrack. NieR Replicant takes place more than 1400 years in our future, where the world is in a state of decay. Plague and disease run rampant as populations around the world continue to fall and people struggle to survive. Humanity is reverted to living in small villages with limited technology and resources. On top of that, shadowy figures known as shades roam the areas between villages and attack people unfortunate enough to cross their path. All of this creates a very dark and somber atmosphere that pretty much defines most of the game. While there are definitely moments that will make you laugh or smile, NieR Replicant's story is ultimately one of tragedy and sorrow. NieR Automata's story was very similar in this regard. Both games provide very emotional and thought-provoking narratives that play with your emotions and make you question many of the actions and events that occur throughout their narratives. One of the main ways that they do this is by creating characters you actually care about and storylines that really hit you right in the feels. NieR Replicant introduces a lot of interesting characters over the course of the game, from the twin caretakers Devila and Popola, to the robot-hating blacksmith Gideon, to the red bag-wearing ferryman who loves to eat apples. These characters make your journey very interesting because of their unique personalities and heartbreaking storylines. These are people that you want to interact with and help out because of who they are, and that in turn incentivizes you to play through the game. However, the characters that drive this game's story and make this narrative the gem that it is are Grimoire Weiss, Kaine, and Emile, as well as your character that you name yourself. Your character is a boy who is responsible for taking care of his younger sister Yona, who is suffering from a disease known as the Black Scrawl. Currently, there is no known cure for this disease, which basically makes it a death sentence for anyone who gets it. Your character has been trying to ease his sister's pain while simultaneously searching for a cure. Early on in the game, you encounter a magical book known as Grimoire Weiss, who has lost his memory. After meeting him, you learn he might have the ability to cure the Black Scrawl if he helps you defeat a black book known as Grimoire Noir. In order to do that, you need to collect items known as sealed verses, which are essentially magical powers. The first half of the game basically involves you and Weiss traveling around trying to find these sealed verses while helping people along the way. Grimoire Weiss is probably my favorite character in the entire NieR universe. He is very talkative and often arrogant at times, always saying what's on his mind and never holding back. He'll complain about you constantly meddling in other people's affairs and the difficulties that you and he must go through in order to complete certain tasks. Ultimately though, he is a kind-hearted individual who wants to help the people he encounters. His commentary is often very amusing, and the banter he has with other characters is usually good for a chuckle or two.
Weiss, what do I do?
You turn on your heel and walk away as fast as your legs can carry you, my good lad.
Honestly, his commentary was one of the things I look forward to the most as I made my way through the game. He made otherwise dull trips and side quests much more entertaining with his witty remarks and sarcastic humor. Vice really was one of the few bright spots in an otherwise dark and gloomy narrative. During your travels, you'll also come across two other individuals named Kaine and Emil who will also join you on your quest. Kaine is a tough warrior who is very prone to angry outbursts that involve a lot of cursing. She's basically an outcast because of a certain bodily condition, so she mostly keeps to herself. When she does speak up though, she is also very entertaining to listen to, especially when she trades jabs with Grimoire Vice.
How about I cram your face up your own asshole, book?
Emil is another interesting character. I don't want to spoil anything by telling you much about him, but I will say that this is what he looks like for a large portion of the game. His story and background is one of the more tragic parts of Replicant's narrative, as is Kaine's background, but despite that, he still makes for an enjoyable traveling companion. These four characters are the core of Replicant's story and a huge part of why it's so fantastic. They go through a lot of things over the course of the game, and you really feel for these guys as they make their way through these tragic events. Having characters you care about is such an important part of a good story, and this game delivers on that beautifully. As with Automata, I don't want to say too much more about Replicant's story because I don't want to spoil it. This is one of those games where knowing almost nothing going in is important for fully appreciating its story. What I've mentioned so far is just simple background information so that you have at least some idea of what to expect when you play this game. The only other thing I will mention is that there is a time skip about halfway through the game that splits the story into two acts. The second act will turn your character from a boy to a young adult and will change the objective of the game. Instead of pursuing the sealed verses, you will instead be collecting fragments of a key that will allow you to access the final area of the game. This also has some implications for the gameplay as well, which I'll talk about later. Overall, this game's narrative truly is spectacular. It's filled with likable characters that you'll enjoy interacting with, and heartbreaking storylines that may even bring a tear to your eye. It's an emotional roller coaster that will have you thinking about it long after the final credits have rolled. While there are certainly other aspects of this game that make it enjoyable, it's the game's story that serves as the main attraction. However, while I think this game's narrative is fantastic, I do have two significant problems with it that I'd like to quickly discuss here. The first issue I have is how Replicant handles its multiple endings. Like Automata, this remaster of NieR Replicant has 5 endings to the game that you'll need to see in order to get the full story. Endings A through E are achieved by meeting certain conditions during your playthrough. My issue with these endings is not what happens in them, but rather the conditions required to unlock them. Ending A is achieved by simply playing through the entire game once. No problems there. Ending B requires you to replay most of the second act of the game, but this time with additional cutscenes and dialogue that weren't there before. I thought this was really cool and a great way to tell this game's narrative. Playing through the second act a second time with the additional cutscenes and dialogue really changes your perspective on certain events, which makes you question a lot of what you thought before. My issue has to do with the fact that the requirements for ending C and D are unnecessary. To get these endings, you need to play through Act 2 a third time and reach the final area with every single weapon in the game. When you reach the end, you'll be given a new choice that will affect the outcome of the story. I personally thought this was a waste of time that didn't add anything to the story at all. It was quite honestly boring playing through the same events for a third time when they didn't add anything new. The choice that leads to these endings could have simply been added onto the end of your second playthrough when everything would have been exactly the same. Making us play through the second half of the game a third time and collect every weapon in the game is just plain unnecessary, and quite honestly takes away from the experience a little bit. Despite this, however, it is worth it to go through this extra hassle because ending E, which is exclusive to this remastered version, is the perfect way to end the game. It concludes everything very nicely and actually provides some of my favorite gameplay in the entire game. The other issue I have has to do with how this game handles its lore. Actually, I have a problem with how Automata handles this as well. The lore in the NieR universe is some of the most interesting lore I've seen in a video game in a long time. I find the backgrounds of these games fascinating and integral to understanding the unique stories they are trying to tell. The problem is, a lot of this universe's lore is not in the games themselves. While there's enough lore in these games to have a basic understanding of the story, there are still a lot of things that aren't clear without outside help, at least for me. I've had to do a bunch of research online to find the answers to a lot of the questions I had upon completing both Replicant and Automata. What I found was fascinating, and it gave me a much better understanding of what's going on in these games, but it made me question why this information wasn't in Replicant and Automata to begin with. These games would be even more fantastic than they already are if this information had just been included from the start, because certain events would have been a lot clearer. I understand that the omission of this information may have been a stylistic choice by series producer Yoko Taro, and I respect that, but for me, it's something I really think should have been included in the games. Those issues aside, however, NieR Replicant's story really is phenomenal and definitely worth playing through. Now let's talk about the gameplay. NieR Replicant's combat is both satisfying and enjoyable, but I feel it ultimately falls short of Automata's combat. Your moveset consists of a series of different weapons, several magical abilities, an evade ability, and a blocking ability. Combat basically involves mixing up sword attacks with different magical abilities, all while evading and countering enemy attacks. This is very similar to what you'll find in Automata, but I think Automata improves on these mechanics in pretty much every way. First, let's start with the weapons. There are 3 different types of weapons found throughout the game: one-handed swords, two-handed swords, and spears. As a boy, you'll only be able to use the one-handed weapons, while the other 2 categories become available after the time skip. Each weapon has a light and heavy attack that you can use to take down opponents, and different types of weapons are usually better for different situations. For example, two-handed weapons are much larger and have a wider range, but are much slower to swing around. I actually preferred using two-handed weapons myself, specifically the Kusanagi, but all 3 weapon types are effective and fun to use. Evading and blocking attacks are also quite satisfying, especially when you counter opponents or make this cool move behind them. Evading attacks really opens up the movement in this game and makes it fun to move around, something that Automata also did a great job with. While blocking attacks is quite useful, I actually ended up ditching this ability for one of the sealed verses called Dark Gluttony, which allowed me to absorb magical attacks and return them in a powerful magical beam. As you collect sealed verses during the game's first act, you'll unlock new magical powers like Dark Gluttony that each provide their own unique gameplay styles. My personal favorites were Dark Lance and Dark Blast because they allowed me to take out enemies from a distance. Some of the other ones you'll find include a shielding ability and a giant magical fist that pummels opponents. Each of these abilities is tied to a blue magic meter that you'll find in the top right corner of your screen. As you level up, your maximum available magic will increase, as will your maximum health. You'll also be able to improve these abilities by using this game's upgrade system. When you defeat shades, they will sometimes drop items called words, which you can apply to either your weapons, your magic, or yourself. For example, there are words that will increase your attack power, words that will decrease the cost of your magical abilities, and words that will increase your magic recovery rate. These will make you quite powerful, especially when paired with weapons you improve at the game's blacksmith. Early on in the game, you'll be able to visit the shop where you can upgrade your weapons if you have the proper materials. Like Automata, you can collect materials out in the world, get them from enemies, or buy them from the game's shops. Upgrading a weapon will significantly improve its attack power, and may even provide other benefits like more magic power or better armor break. As you can see, this game has a lot of good systems and solid combat, and by itself it beats out a lot of other games. However, when you compare it to Automata, I just feel that the sequel does a better job in almost every aspect. For example, when it comes to the upgrade system, I feel Automata's chip system is significantly superior. It allows for a lot more customization and control over how you want to play the game, and even lets you craft your own upgrades to create more powerful versions. You also get 3 different chips you can swap between on the fly, so you can quickly change your playstyle without needing to spend time reconfiguring everything. The way it handles weapons is also superior. In that game, you can equip 2 weapons at once instead of only 1, and you can do a lot of cool combos with them by mixing up light and heavy attacks. You can also switch between 2 different weapon sets at the push of a button, whereas in Replicant, you need to pause the game to switch your weapon in the middle of combat. Even the way combat feels is slightly better in Automata than it is in Replicant. Moving around and swinging a sword feels just a little bit smoother and a little bit faster in Automata, making for a slightly faster and more hectic gameplay experience, which I kind of prefer. I will also say that Replicant's combat is a little easier than Automata's, which was already pretty easy to begin with, at least on normal. Shades make for decent opponents, but honestly weren't that difficult to deal with. Most went down pretty easily, though bosses at least posed a decent challenge the first time through. However, during my second and third playthroughs, I was significantly overpowered and took down enemies very easily, including the bosses. There are actually achievements I wasn't aware of for beating bosses within a certain time limit, and I'm pretty sure I got every single one without even trying during my third playthrough. It made that playthrough even more annoying because there was virtually no challenge at all. From my understanding, hard mode does make enemies much tougher to take down and makes you less powerful, but I don't have any experience with that difficulty, so I can't really say. But even though I think Automata's gameplay is superior to Replicant's in a lot of ways, I do want to be clear that Replicant's combat is very well done and a great part of this game. The story may be the main attraction here, but the gameplay is definitely worth it on its own. Before I finish off this review, I do want to take a moment to highlight something very special about these NieR games. If you haven't guessed already from my videos, I'm a big fan of video game soundtracks. I think they are so important for accentuating what's going on in a game, whether it's an emotional moment, an epic moment, or simply a break in the action. They become a defining part of the gameplay experience, and something I always look forward to whenever there's a track in a game or franchise I really enjoy. While I've heard a lot of amazing gaming soundtracks over the years, there's something really special about NieR's music. These are some of the most moving moving, emotional, and epic soundtracks that I have ever heard, and they are such an integral part of why this game's story and gameplay work so well. I always enjoy finding new gaming soundtracks to obsess over, and I believe the music in Replicant and Automata truly is some of the best out there. Between Replicant's fantastic story, well-executed gameplay, and incredible soundtrack, there's a lot to love about this game. Even with some of the issues I described in this video, I had a great time playing this, and I think many of you will too. If you played Automata first like I did, I think you will really enjoy what this game has to offer. There are a lot of similarities between the two gameplay-wise, and the story tugs on your heartstrings in the same way that Automata's did. If you've never played a NieR game before, I highly recommend playing both Replicant and Automata. Both are fantastic games with emotional stories, excellent gameplay, and beautiful soundtracks. These games are experiences and very unique from a lot of other titles you'll find out there. They've become some of my favorite titles from the last several years, and games that I'll be playing for a very long time.